Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Jason Freeman, producer, or JP Freeman, actually. We're using initials tonight. Producer and editor here at the library's Author Events Office. And I'm very excited to be here to introduce H.W. Brands. Exploring such diverse subjects as, deep breath to say them all, Aaron Burr, the death of American liberalism, Ronald Reagan, the California Gold Rush, Andrew Jackson, the Middle East, the Vietnam War, Bill Gates, and frankly, too many other people, places, and concepts to mention here. H.W. Brands, according to the Boston Globe, is a skilled narrator who believes in making good history accessible to the non-specializing book lover. His more than 24 books, quote, weave together keen political history with anecdote and marvelous sense of place. His best-selling biographies of Benjamin Franklin, the first American and personal hero of mine, Franklin Roosevelt, Traitor to his class, were both finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. A professor at Texas A&M University for 16 years, Professor Brands now teaches at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is the Dixon Allen Anderson Centennial Professor of History, which has to be hard to fit on a business card. He is also a member of the Society of American Historians and the Philosophical Society of Texas, a regular commentator across a variety of media, and his work has been translated into several languages. His latest book is called Heirs of the Founders, the epic rivalry of HenryClay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, the second generation of American giants. It tells the rarely told story of the second generation of American statesmen, the early 19th century political giants who took up the daunting challenge of completing the constitutional work begun by the Founding Fathers. These three men, Webster, the eloquent orator from Massachusetts who spoke for the Northern business class, Clay, the jaunty Kentuckian who represented the potential of the ascending West, and Calhoun, the firebrand South Carolinian who was a staunch advocate for the South and slavery, embodied the hopes, scandals, triumphs, hypocrisies, and utter heart of our early republic. And in reading this book, it occurs to me they might even help shed a little light on some of our contemporary political triumphs and boondoggles. Here to tell us more, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome back H.W. Brands to the Free Library.
Thank you, Jason, for that very kind introduction. In fact, that was such a lively introduction. It's better than I wrote in the book. I think I'm going to borrow it for the revised edition. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted to be back here in Philadelphia because my first visit as an author to Philadelphia is what gave rise to the book that I have just completed, just published. I wrote a book on Benjamin Franklin, and the very last line of that Franklin biography is a quote from Franklin, one of the very last lines that he's quoted saying in his life, and it arose when he walked out of the Constitutional Convention, which, as you well know, was held in secret. And so people in Philadelphia didn't know quite what was going on behind those closed doors. And he came out. Dr. Franklin was a recognizable fellow, and a woman of Philadelphia went up to him and said, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us after these 3 months of work? And he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. So this was something that stuck in my mind. The founding generation won independence for the United States, created this new constitution, set up a federal government. But the question was, could the subsequent generation keep it? I have observed bookstores and libraries for some years, and I'm aware, as you probably are yourselves, that the amount of books, the number of books written on the Revolutionary War, the Constitution, is enormous. And the number of books written on the Civil War is even larger. But between, it's sort of like the tall buildings in the lower end of Manhattan and the tall buildings in Midtown, and in between, there's this dip in the skyline. So I wanted to explain what went on in the interim. I have the advantage, for an author, of teaching American history. So I've been teaching American history. I've been teaching this subject now for 35 years or so. So I knew what happened. I knew what the big events were. I knew who the big names were. But I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and find out what it was that drove the politics of that interim period. And so I sometimes fall prey to, actually the demographers don't do this, but commentators, historians often speak of generations in history. And it's a rather suspect categorization because people are born every year. They don't wait, just every 25 years to be born. And so I'm a baby boomer, and I'm sort of in the middle of the baby boom. I was born in 1953. But the baby boom supposedly stretches from 1946 to 1964 if you were born there. And I can tell you, if you were born in 1962, your life was very different from somebody who was born in 1948. But anyway, be that as it may, it's tempting, and I fell for the temptation. So I'm speaking in this book about what you could call the second generation of Americans and the second generation of American politicians. I do have a tendency to think of history in terms of biography. So I wrote a series of biographies that summarized or covered American history from the 18th century to the 21st. My book on Benjamin Franklin was volume 1, and that was followed by Andrew Jackson, which is volume 2, and Ulysses Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. And I was intrigued, I was attracted by the genre of biography because it is in some ways the most novelistic. You get the most internal dialogue. You get the most dialogue between characters. In most nonfiction, most historical nonfiction particularly, there's not much in the way of people speaking to each other. Of course, in novels, people speak to each other all the time, and you get inside the heads of your characters. Well, you can do that in a biography in a way you typically can't in most histories. But I confess that at the end of completing these 6 biographies, I was kind of biographied out. And this for a couple of reasons. One is, as hard as I tried to resist the temptation or the tendency to treat the world as though it revolves around your subject, biographers can hardly help it because it's a story of this person. And you have to keep coming back to this person. And so I tried to create or write about the foils for my subjects, but it's still not the same. They don't get equal time. So there was that part of it. And I confess there was something else. Biographies of big characters tend to be big books. And after committing 900 pages to Theodore Roosevelt and 750 to Benjamin Franklin, and I think I was getting trimmer by the time I got to Reagan. So I think Reagan only gets 700 or something like that. That was still a big lift, and I thought, set that down. I took to heart advice that the wife of Elmore Leonard, the mystery writer, deceased a few years ago, is said to have given him. She was his first reader. And he would give her a manuscript, and she would read it. And as the story goes, she would write just one brief comment. And it was the same comment every time. And it was, take out the boring stuff. Now, when you write a biography, as interesting as your subject might be, there are times in that person's life that are kind of boring. But you've committed to write the biography, and so you have to cover it. I skimmed over a lot of stuff, but still, if it happens in the life, you can't just say, and 15 years later, because what happened in those 15 years? So what I wanted to do is I wanted to get away from the one-person biography. I wanted to at least get 2 views. And I also wanted to skip the boring stuff. So I've embarked on, I'm not going to say this is a long-term project, but I have decided to write about at least 2, or in this case, 3 people. And the more contentious they are, the better. So I wrote a book about Douglas MacArthur and Harry Truman and the fight they got in the middle of the Korean War that pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war. It was called The General versus the President. I liked it. It was a little bit shorter than a big biography, but it, in effect, was 2 biographies in one, but just the high points, the most dramatic moments of the 2 lives. So I decided to apply this approach to this, I won't call it exactly a black hole of American history between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, but we'll call it an unappreciated, an under-resourced part of American history. And it was my good fortune, I really can't say it was my good fortune because I designed it this way, to have three characters whose careers overlapped almost exactly. HenryClay, Daniel Webster, and John Calhoun all entered Congress just in time for the War of 1812. HenryClay and John Calhoun were advocates of the war. They were some of the original war hawks. That term was used back in those days. Daniel Webster was an opponent of the War of 1812. And they immediately became standouts in Congress. Oh, there was another little aspect of my agenda here, and that was to essentially recapture, I hesitate to use the word, original meaning of the Constitution because that's been co-opted, but I wanted to basically recapture Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution deals with the legislative branch, deals with Congress. And it's clear from the detail, the length of that article, and all the attention paid to that article in the Constitutional Convention, that the framers of the Constitution intended that Congress should be the driving force in America's federal government. And that's the way it was for the first 120 years or so of American history. In fact, I could give a quick quiz, but I'll just let you do this as a mental exercise instead. How many of you think you could name 10 presidents from the year 1900 to the present? 10 presidents within 15 seconds. I'll put it this way. If I rattled off the names, I'm sure you would immediately remember all of them. So, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, etc. They're all big names in American history. But if I asked you for some of the particulars, Franklin Pierce, or James D. Buchanan, or Millard Fillmore, or John Tyler, or Zachary Taylor, the names are not so familiar. I've been in this business of presidential history for a long time, and I still have to think pretty carefully. Now, when exactly did Franklin Pierce serve as president? And was he before or after Millard Fillmore? And how was it that James Buchanan got elected? Why is it that presidents of the 19th century are so unmemorable? Because that's the way the Constitution was designed. The big figures, the stars of American politics, were supposed to be members of Congress. So, my story is about the three rock stars of American politics in the first half of the 19th century. And they were HenryClay. HenryClay was so gifted. He was such a consummate politician. And this was recognized by his peers, that he was made Speaker of the House of Representatives on his very first day in the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi, eat your heart out. So, HenryClay is, in fact, if there's a single star of my three, he's the one. He is the one who has the greatest array of political skills, who has the best personality for politics. In some ways, he is the best situated. Now, when we think of the sectional crisis in America, we typically think of North and South. But in fact, in the 19th century, the early 19th century especially, there was the North, there was the South, and then there was the West. And the West was everything across the Appalachian Mountains. So Clay, being from Kentucky, was a man of the West. And as a man of the West, he could act as a mediator, a go-between between North and South. So Clay is my man of the West. Daniel Webster originally from New Hampshire, originally elected to Congress from New Hampshire, then moved his law practice to Boston and was elected to the Senate from Massachusetts. Webster is the spokesman for New England, for the North. Webster, in an age of great political oratory, was the greatest of all. HenryClay was known for his ability to enchant an audience. But Daniel Webster was sort of the version of grand opera. He could make you laugh, he could make you cry. Daniel Webster also, besides being a senator and a member of the House of Representatives, was a constitutional lawyer. And he would often go from arguing cases before the Supreme Court, which in those days met in the basement of the Capitol. He'd run upstairs to the Senate and give another speech there. Daniel Webster was known for his ability to make even Supreme Court justices weep when he would give his oral arguments. John Marshall of all people, had a tear in his eye when Webster closed his argument in the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward. It's a small college, but there are those who love it. Yes, indeed. John Calhoun was something of an enigma because he might very well have been the most incisively intelligent of the three. If you wanted a lawyer to be able to defend a position and come up with the most subtle, the most elaborate arguments in defense of the position, John Calhoun was your man. If you ever got into a debate with John Calhoun, you had to be very careful. Do not grant his premises, because if you give him his premises, his ironclad logic will just roll through and you will be rolled over. John Calhoun might have been the most ambitious of the three. They were all fairly ambitious. Daniel Webster had this constant fear of not having enough money. It's one of the reasons that he kept up his law practice. And this was in an age when our modern concepts of conflicts of interest were not very well developed. So in the middle of a debate in Congress over the Bank of the United States, more precisely the Second Bank of the United States, Webster wrote a note, to Nicholas Biddle, the director of the bank. Now, Webster is about to go to Washington, and he's going to speak for the bank or against the bank. And he writes a letter to Nicholas Biddle saying, if you would like your case argued, my retainer must be refreshed. And he got his money, and he made the argument in favor of the bank. These days, well, maybe should I say these days, or at least until, I'll pick a date out of the air, January 20th, 2017, I don't know. That sort of thing would have just been a bit out of bounds. Anyway, so these are my three characters. I will confess that as I get older, I get more interested in sort of the deep, you could call them philosophical questions, you could call them moral questions, you could call them psychological questions of history. And I wanted to see how America, embodied in these three men, and the generation around them, the book is not just about these three, it's about Andrew Jackson plays a large role, other people play large roles. But how did America wrestle, deal with, confront the two big, what shall I say, failings, I'll say failings, failings of the founding generation, in particular, those egregious omissions of the framers of the Constitution. You know what I'm talking about. You know those two big holes in the Constitution. One, what exactly is the nature of the trade-off between the central government and the states? We've got this federal system, and I will remind you, the reason we have a federal system is not that anybody in the 1780s thought, hey, this is a great idea. Let's have a two-tiered system. It's that the people who wrote the Constitution essentially effected a silent coup to overthrow the government of the Articles of Confederation. They invited representatives of the states. The states already existed. The states were clearly sovereign under the Articles of Confederation. And they brought them to Philadelphia under the false pretenses of merely amending the existing Articles of Confederation. And the small states came assured by the fact that, well, even one small state could veto any amendment to the Articles, so they're safe. Actually, Rhode Island didn't feel quite safe. It boycotted the proceedings. It definitely, I guess they figured out what was going on. And so, the reason we have a federal system is that's the only thing that they could get passed, the only thing they could get ratified. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they would have rather have had just a single central government. But the states already existed, so they had to graft this stronger federal government on top of it. But they conspicuously omitted to say, where precisely does the boundary lie between the states and the federal government? Or to put it another way, if the federal government oversteps its bounds, what recourse do the states have? Who will tell the federal government that it has overstepped its bounds? And they weren't thinking of the Supreme Court because they hadn't been introduced to John Marshall yet. And the Constitution doesn't say that the Supreme Court can render federal legislation null. No, that was Marshall's idea. And during the whole period that I write about, my main characters died. John Calhoun in 1850, Daniel Webster and HenryClay in 1852. So right to the midpoint of the 19th century. The idea that the Supreme Court could overrule legislation, this was something that existed in the head of John Marshall till he died in 1835, and a couple other people, but it was not conventional wisdom. Andrew Jackson didn't believe it. Daniel Webster didn't believe it. Most people didn't believe it. This is something we eventually came to, maybe for want of anything better. But the question, how do the states, how do the people restrain the federal government when the federal government is getting too pushy? That's one question. And it's not in the Constitution. So I put it to my students. I'll put it to you. Why is it not in the Constitution? These people were lawyers. They knew enough that problems like this would arise. And so why didn't they write it down? Why didn't they write it down? Because they knew perfectly well. As soon as they wrote it down, the Constitution would not get ratified. That's the same reason that the Constitutional Convention was held in secret. If word got out what they were doing, the whole thing would blow up in their faces. So that's problem number one. Problem number two. How does a republic, based on, it's either the promise or the challenge in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. If you've got a republic based on the idea that all men are created equal, how does this deal with inequality? We got this promise of equality, and a republic is essentially premised on the idea, a republic is a political system where political power rests on the people. What do you do when there are great forms of inequality? And inequalities came in a variety of shapes and forms in the 1780s and 1790s. And there were inequalities of wealth and property ownership and education, inequalities between men and women, between the old and the young, between natural-born citizens and immigrants, all sorts of inequalities. The inequality that came most to the fore during the first half of the 19th century was the inequality embedded in slavery. So, how can a republic, based on this idea that all men are created equal, how can it countenance slavery? These are the two issues that this generation had to deal with. When Benjamin Franklin said, "A republic if you can keep it," he was basically saying to the generation of HenryClay, Daniel Webster, and John Calhoun, can you accommodate these? We did a lot, our generation. We gained independence from Britain, and we've established this new government. It's up and running. Now it's yours to keep going. So, this was the challenge. I wrote about these three men, and 3 is a good number if you want, well, maybe you remember your junior high school days, that 3 is a bad number for trying to get along, because it always turns out to be 2 against 1. Well, if you're going to write a book and you want a little conflict in your book, 3 is a great number. And one of the striking things is that the alliances among the 3, the alliances and antagonism shifted over time, as did the views of the 3 on, well, the 2 questions that I just pointed out. HenryClay was the most consistent of the 3. And HenryClay was someone that's hard for people in the 21st century to get their heads around. HenryClay was a slave-owning emancipationist. Now, you should think about that for a moment, and your first reaction, I think, so I put this to my students, and their first reaction is, well, if he's such an emancipationist, why doesn't he free his slaves? which is not a bad question. But he had an answer. And it was based on, well, a couple of things, actually. I give my students a thought experiment. And it goes roughly like this. And I'm not really going astray, because this is the sort of thing that HenryClay had to deal with. So my students are 18 and 19 years old. I teach a freshman class in American history. And I say, okay, let's suppose that you were born in Georgia. You were born in Georgia in 1840. And you grew up, you're a white boy or girl, growing up in Georgia into a planter family. And you grew up with slaves around you, and this was just your way of life. And actually, I have to specify that you're a boy because you're going to go to college. And girls didn't go to college then. But your parents did something that a lot of Southern parents did and still do. They sent their teenage male children north to college. So you went to Princeton, or the College of New Jersey it was called then. And when you got there, you discovered this movement called abolitionism. So we're now into the late 1850s, about 1856 or 1857. You didn't hear much about it, and you certainly didn't hear anything good about it as long as you were in Georgia. The mails were censored, newspapers didn't cover anything like it except to criticize those horrible black Republican abolitionists. But you get to Princeton, and you hear some of them speak. You say, you know what? They make a lot of sense. I think I want to join that cause. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet, but I want to. You get a letter from home. It's a sad letter. And the letter says, your father has died. You are now the heir to the plantation. You are now the owner of 150 slaves. I ask my students, what do you do? And so the way I conduct my classes is not really as lectures. I have the students, they all have a piece of paper out and a pen. I say, okay, write down what your response is. You get this letter. What do you do? What are you going to do about the slaves? And the first reaction of most of them is, well, I'm going to free the slaves. And so I let them write it down. And then I say, well, I have to add some complicating factors. One is that if your plantation is like most plantations, you own the slaves in the way most people own their homes, which is to say, for 30 years they don't actually own the homes. The bank owns the homes, and they live in them, and they pay the bank. And the home itself is collateral for the loan. Agriculture is a notoriously sort of debt-ridden business, and very many slave owners, perhaps including you now, can't operate your plantation without credit. And you don't get any credit if you don't have any slaves, because they're the only valuable property you have. So your creditors will not let you free your slaves if you want to. By the way, Thomas Jefferson was in this boat. When he died, he couldn't free his slaves in his will the way George Washington did, because the creditors got the slaves. So that's the first problem. A second problem is, let's suppose that you're not in debt at all. Let's suppose you own the slaves free and clear. Then, do you simply free the slaves? And the answer is, well, you got to think carefully about it, because most southern states, including Georgia by this time, had strict laws against manumitting, freeing slaves, unless you send them out of the state, because they didn't want free blacks hanging around giving ideas to the blacks who are still enslaved. So if you free your slaves, you're probably going to break up families, because some of the families, many of the slaves on your plantation are married to or have children on other plantations. So the point I'm making here is that in this aspect of history, as in all aspects of history, things are more complicated than they seem. So HenryClay, in one of his first acts as a Kentucky legislator, tried to get Kentucky to end slavery. He said because it's bad for the slaves, it's bad for the white people, it's bad for the Kentucky economy. All you had to do was take a trip along the Ohio River, float down the Ohio River, and on the right bank was the free state of Ohio. And you would see thriving towns and farms that were active. You would see a growing economy. On the left side, you would see slave Kentucky. And you would go miles and miles and miles between towns. And compared to Ohio, there was almost nothing going on. So Clay tried to convince his fellow Kentuckians to end slavery, a phase out of slavery, the way slavery was phased out in most of the northern states as well. He failed. So you might have said, okay, well, Henry, now free your slaves. He didn't. Now, partly because it was, well, the only way he could run his plantation, staff his house, but also because, and you can judge for yourself, this I just put it out there in the book, you can judge whether you think this was warranted or not. He concluded that he would have more credibility arguing against slavery as a slave holder than if he was just another abolitionist. You know, it's often pointed out in history. It seems like a contradiction that Thomas Jefferson, the one who wrote, "All men are created equal," in fact owned between 150 and 200 slaves. Is there anything more hypocritical than that? Maybe, but think for a moment. Why was Jefferson invited to write the Declaration of Independence? It was partly because he was a skilled, a stylish writer, but also he was from Virginia. And Virginia had to be part of this independence movement. And so there was going to be somebody from Virginia who was going to be on this committee. And if you were in the Continental Congress from Virginia, you were going to own slaves. You had to be successful. You had to be respected by your peers in order to get this position. And so if Thomas Jefferson had not owned slaves, he never would have been allowed to write the Declaration of Independence. Anyway, so HenryClay deals with this question his whole life, and he does finally free his slaves upon his death. That's HenryClay. John Calhoun. And I should add that HenryClay was a consistent advocate of the Union, of federal power. HenryClay believed that the federal government ought to build highways. They're called internal improvements in those highways and canals. The federal government ought to establish a protective tariff to shield American manufacturers from unfair foreign competition. When I was writing the book, I thought, oh boy, I got to write about the tariff. It's a big deal in those times, but it simply is not going to resonate with modern audiences. I tell you, I've got something to thank President Trump for, to make the tariff a real issue, because before 2017, nobody had really talked seriously about a tariff since the 1930s. Anyway, it's back. But it also exemplifies this question of what's federal authority? What's the federal authority versus the states? And I say versus the states because one of the crises of my era, of my story, occurs in the early 1830s when South Carolina objects to a federal tariff and, in fact, nearly blows up the Union. Now, my students have a hard time really appreciating this. They say, okay, South Carolina was going to leave the Union, provoking Andrew Jackson to talk in terms of war against South Carolina over what? Over a tariff? Over taxes? Yeah, exactly. So this was a big deal. John Calhoun was bitterly opposed to the tariff. Not so much on economic grounds per se, but on what it did to the interests of South Carolina. John Calhoun started his political career as an ardent nationalist. He was in favor of the War of 1812 against Britain, but he swung around by the late 1820s to be the apostle of states' rights. And to show how convoluted politics could be, as vice president of the United States, he secretly provided the intellectual and political rationale for South Carolina's nullification of this federal tariff and the justification if South Carolina should be forced to collect the tariff, then South Carolina would secede from the Union. And he did this while he was Vice President of the United States. And this sounds bizarre, but it actually, believe it or not, it had precedent. Some of you may remember from your study of American history. I have to be careful the way I say that. I speak in Austin at the University of Texas to some continuing education programs. And these are mostly retired people. And I was speaking about Benjamin Franklin one time when I was there. And I was trying to remind the audience. What I meant to say was, you will recall from your study of American history that the Stamp Act of 1765 was very controversial in America. What I said was, you will remember that the Stamp Act of 1765 was very controversial. And a gentleman in the back stood up and said, "Sonny, how old do you think we are?" Anyway, in 1798, the Federalist-dominated Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were a blatant violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution. The Supreme Court was not very supreme in those days. It didn't step in. And so Thomas Jefferson, who was Vice President of the United States, covertly authored a series of resolutions that he sent to the legislature of Kentucky to pass, basically outlining the philosophy, the theory of nullification. When the federal government oversteps, the states can step in. They can refuse to enforce the law within their boundaries. And the logical corollary of that is, if the federal government tries to force them, then they can resist. They can leave the Union. So this is Jefferson, and James Madison did the same thing on behalf of the legislature of Virginia. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, saying that the states can overrule the federal government. This gave John Calhoun the basis for doing the same thing with South Carolina over this tariff. And the country came very close to a civil war at that time. Andrew Jackson breathed fire and compelled the South Carolinians to back down. In the middle of this was HenryClay. HenryClay already had the reputation as the great compromiser. HenryClay was the one who negotiated, who forged the Missouri Compromise of 1820, where the question was, shall Missouri, the first state, save Louisiana itself, to be made a state out of the Louisiana Purchase? And there were very many people in the United States who hoped that slavery would be stopped at the Mississippi River. But in fact, in Missouri, there were already a lot of people who owned slaves, and a lot of slaves there, and they wanted admission to the Union as a slave state. And they had strong support in the South. They had some support in the North. But there are a lot of people in the North who said, no, we don't like this. We kept slavery out of the Ohio country, and now we want to keep it out of the trans-Mississippi West. I have to remind my students, I'll remind you of this, that when the Constitution was written, one of the reasons that the framers did not bite the bullet on that question of slavery and say, okay, we'll give slavery 20 years and then it's done, is that they expected that something like that would happen on its own. They did put a 20-year limit on the slave trade, but in 1780, in the late 1780s even, it was the best guess of most people that slavery would die of its own weight. It had already died out in the North, not because the North had any fit of morality, but because the Northern economy had evolved beyond slavery. Slavery is, among other things, a way of mobilizing labor, and it is highly inflexible. You don't get to fire slaves. You don't get to lay them off. If there's not much work to do, you still have to house them, feed them, and all the other stuff. The Northern economy moved to a wage system. There had been a lot of indentured servants in the North, but those faded away too because they're pretty inflexible as well. And people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and certainly the young HenryClay, believed that would happen. And so the whole point of the Missouri Compromise, which gave Missouri as a slave state to the South in exchange for a line across the Louisiana Territory that said, okay, Louisiana Purchase, that said in the North, no slaves, in the South, potentially slaves. His whole idea was to buy time. HenryClay was a believer that the genius of the American political system is the ability to muddle through. Find a compromise, kick the can down the road, and things will evolve. Don't be doctrinaire. Don't insist on solving everything at once. And the Missouri Compromise of 1820 bore this out. It lasted for 30 years until it had to be revised after the gold rush to California, when California demanded admission to the Union as a free state. And HenryClay came out of retirement and organized an 8-part package that became the basis for the Compromise of 1850. By this time, John Calhoun was all in on states' rights. He resisted anything like compromise. He said the South has already compromised too much, and he resisted it. But he was dying, and in fact, he died in the middle of tuberculosis, or consumption it was called then, in the middle of this debate, leaving the field to HenryClay and Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster represented Massachusetts, which had grown increasingly opposed to slavery. But Daniel Webster was perhaps the most eloquent of the defenders of the Union. And Daniel Webster decided that holding the Union together was more important than satisfying his constituents, more important than carving out what he himself considered to be the moral position on slavery. He joined HenryClay in supporting this compromise. And the essence of the compromise was that California gets admitted as a free state, and the South, in exchange, gets a beefed-up Fugitive Slave Act, which required northern sheriffs, northern judges, northern private individuals to assist in the return of escaped slaves. And this outraged many people in the North. Daniel Webster, from being the hero of Massachusetts, found himself hanged in effigy throughout Massachusetts. But in some ways, it was, well, you'll form your own judgments as to whether it was his finest hour or his worst hour, but it certainly was a big deal at the time. I'm going to stop there, but I'll leave you with one thing, and then we're going to take some questions, and then we can go on with that. But if there's one takeaway that I get from this, it is that in our political system, there is a great deal to be said in favor of compromise. The spirit of compromise embodied by HenryClay, and I will say certainly Daniel Webster, and maybe even the early John Calhoun. The elderly John Calhoun didn't believe in compromise, but the spirit of compromise that says, first of all, democracy is fragile and you have to take care of it. Second, that no one has a monopoly on truth, that your opponents are not your enemies. Your opponents have a right to their opinions, and they have a right to a seat at the table. That if you want to get that can successfully kicked down the road, you can't insist on getting everything you want just because you have the opportunity to do it now. You have to look 20, 30 years into the future. So that was the spirit. I'll point out that when that I'll call it the compromising generation, the generation represented by these three died in the early 1850s, it was replaced by the non-compromisers. And within 10 years, the nation was dissolving into civil war. And I would say that today, we could use a lot more of that spirit of compromise. Today, the disputes, the lines of demarcation are not sectional, not North versus South, but partisan, Republicans versus Democrats. But there is very much this winner-takes-all attitude that afflicts both parties when they have a chance to be in office. And unless we can find somebody to compromise, and maybe compromise will be forced on us now that we've got a split Congress. But I think we could certainly use something like the spirit of compromise of that, call it that middle generation.
I just want to say, when I first moved to Philadelphia, first book I read, your biography on Ben Franklin, best first chapter I've ever read.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
I guess it tailed off after that?
Like you said, there was some peaks and valleys.
All right.
My question is, this day and age with access, unlimited access to information more than ever, as opposed to even say the Ben Franklin era when it was a privileged right. Do you see the idea of like a cyclical history, or we're doomed to repeat history? Do you see any of that evolving or going away now that we should have access to all this information that we shouldn't forget?
I would like to say yes, but I have to say no. And I'd like to say yes because indeed we do have basically instant access to anything you want to know about history. But the problem has never been lack of information. The problem has been lack of will. And I'm not going to say the older I get, the more I conclude this, but for a lot of people, I'm not going to go so far as to say for most people, but for a lot of people, the conclusion is arrived at first. So what do I want to believe? And then I can now, probably more than ever, it's easy to find arguments, evidence, in favor of what you want to believe. Benjamin Franklin himself said, "It is wonderful that humans are reasonable beings because we can reason ourselves into pretty much anything we want to." So, no, it doesn't resolve the problem at all. If anything, it makes it easier to support otherwise insupportable arguments. Because there's always somebody out there, there's always something.
I saw a talk you did about don't dare to be great for the presidency. Do you feel that this generation is like the inspiration for that? Because you're talking about how compromising they are, and they became great, but not necessarily trying to be transformative per se.
When I had said don't dare to be great, I thought you were going to say, were you thinking of Donald Trump? And no, for those of you who didn't see it, the don't dare to be great part is that I've observed in my study of the American presidency that there are only a handful of presidents who are considered really great. And the greatest are, generally, there are three that are that sort of holy trinity of American presidents. There's George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, so I don't think I shared this story with this group the last time I was here, but it's a story of when Barack Obama was president, I had the honor and the privilege of being part of a small group of historians that had dinner with President Obama several times. And he was very interested in history. In fact, I cannot think of a president who had a more consistent and sort of sincere interest in history than President Obama. And the first gathering of the group was just 3 or 4 months into the first term. And I got invited, I think, because I'd just written a book on Franklin Roosevelt. And President Obama was dealing with an economic crisis that looked like it might become Great Depression 2.0. So on that particular evening, the president he spoke, and for most of these events, most of these dinners, he mostly listened. But on this occasion, he was sort of explaining why he invited us and what he hoped to get out of it. And he went through kind of the basic, ordinary perception of who the great presidents are. And he really focused on Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. And the term that was in use at the time, you may remember, was he wanted his to be a transformative presidency, sort of like Abraham Lincoln's or Franklin Roosevelt's. And I sat there, and I was listening to this, and I began puzzling over something. And that is, well, this might come to you anytime you're a guest at someone's house. You're invited to somebody's place for dinner, and they're feeding you, and they're being nice to you, but they're saying something you think is quite wrong-headed. So how forthright are you in explaining your disagreement? And when your host happens to be the President of the United States, that gave me even more pause. But then I thought, okay, the President is a busy guy. And he would not be taking 2 hours out of his day, this particular day, to hear himself talk. Now, there are presidents who have done that. Theodore Roosevelt used to invite distinguished authors and scientists and artists to the White House, and then he'd spend the whole time talking himself. But not President Obama. So I thought, okay, I'm going to speak my piece. And when an opportune moment came, I said, Mr. President, I agree with you that Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt are the great presidents. They're really the measuring stick for presidential greatness. But I'd like to point something out, and that is it's a paradox of American history that the greatest presidents preside over the worst times. Consider Abraham Lincoln. What allowed him to be great? What allowed him to do those things he did, to expand federal power, to end slavery? During peacetime, Congress, the president, the courts, the states could not figure out what to do with slavery for a period of 75 years. And then in 2 years during war, you cut that Gordian knot. And you cut that Gordian knot with a sword of war. So it was the crisis of the Civil War that allowed Lincoln to be great. And for Franklin Roosevelt, it was the crisis of the Great Depression in World War II. So I said, unless you're thinking in terms of another Civil War, another Great Depression, maybe you ought to lower your sights a little. Not Franklin Roosevelt, how about Theodore Roosevelt? Theodore Roosevelt is ranked by historians and political scientists, maybe in the top 5. But for the American people, he had the advantage of presiding over 7.5 years of peace and prosperity. So there's that. And this gets at sort of some of the broader themes here, and that is that the American political system, as much as we grumble about it, and people have been grumbling about the American political system from the moment it started. In fact, if you think we're polarized today, it was worse back in the period that I'm writing about. Sometimes when I give this talk, I say I've been to the 19th century, a time when American politics was even more polarized than it is today, when people actually shot each other in the street over political disputes. I've been to the 19th century and I return with good news and bad news. The good news is the nation survived. The bad news is it took a civil war. So I have no reason to think that there's a civil war coming. Although if you push me in this direction, I can describe a scenario over which it could come about. But I think that it gets back to the theme that I was talking about. When there is that spirit of compromise, our American system, as much as we grumble about it, over time, over the 200 years of its existence, it's been, by the standards of world history, a roaring success. There is no system that has delivered more good things to more people for so many years as the American system, starting with this small country hugging the Atlantic coast of North America to be this world superpower with, arguably even until now, the highest standard of living sort of in world history. We could quibble about whether the Norwegians with their oil have more and all that stuff. But basically, this large country, so it's worked really well. It's had a few big hiccups, like the Civil War. I mean, that's a big hiccup. But for the most part, the status quo works. And there is, maybe there should be, a bias in favor of the status quo. And it's worked so far. So it's hard to get anything done. Why is it that presidents only rise to the level of greatness during crisis? Because in a crisis, the status quo breaks down. And a working majority of the American people are willing to say, okay, it's time for a big change. And then the change comes. But for now, why is it that we can't make up our minds about health care? Why can't we make up our minds about immigration? Why can't we make up our minds about one thing and this thing and that? Well, because it's not that Congress is gummed up exactly, and it's not that the president is screwed up, and it's not that, well, it's because the country is pretty much split down the middle. And in fact, in all of American political history, presidential races, with the exception of James Monroe, who ran unopposed, and George Washington, who ran pretty much unopposed, a landslide in American presidential history is 6-4, 60% for one and 40% for the other. And that's huge in American presidential history. But it still means if you just flip 2 votes out of 10, you get the different result. Anyway.
Going back to HenryClay and the great compromiser, give me your reflection on the election of 1824 and his role that led to such turmoil and political division.
The notorious election of 1824. There were 4 candidates. The one who gained the most popular votes was Andrew Jackson. His reputation rested on his great victory at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. But he had also a long career as he had been a member of Congress, he had been a senator, he had been a territorial governor, and mostly a career soldier as well. So he got the most popular votes, but then, as now, winning the popular vote doesn't get you anything. He had the most electoral votes, but he did not have a majority. And so, under Article 2 of the Constitution, the race went to the House of Representatives, where the top 3 finishers would go into a runoff. HenryClay was one of the 4 candidates, but not one of the top 3. He was also Speaker of the House, and he was an ally of John Quincy Adams, the number 2 finisher. So, when the race went to the House of Representatives, HenryClay was in a position to speak to his friends and allies in the House and urge them to vote for John Quincy Adams, which he did. And John Quincy Adams won. In the House of Representatives, under those circumstances, each state votes as a unit. It acts more like the Senate, where each state gets an equal vote, than it does in normal times. But John Quincy Adams wound up as president. And he turned around and named HenryClay Secretary of State, which was a bigger deal in those days than it is today. Because in those days, the Secretary of State was the heir presumptive to the presidency. Thomas Jefferson had been Secretary of State. He became president. His Secretary of State, James Madison, became president. His Secretary of State, James Monroe, became president, whose Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, became president. So it looked as though HenryClay had traded his influence in the House in return for being anointed the next President of the United States. The Jacksonians cried foul. In fact, they cried corrupt bargain. Andrew Jackson himself spoke of Judas Iscariot and his 30 shekels of silver, 30 silver coins, for betraying the cause. The Jacksonians immediately began running the rematch. The election of 1820, if you think presidential election campaigns are long now, the presidential campaign of 1828 began in March 1825, on the day John Quincy Adams was inaugurated. And the Jacksonians, the term they probably would have used was fake news. Or they would have said the election was stolen. They did say the election was stolen. They said that John Quincy Adams is not the legitimate president. And the election campaign began, and the second go-around, Andrew Jackson won. He won the popular vote. He won the electoral vote. The reason this is important is that these were really the first two, and the second one, 1828, was the first time that a presidential election was even sort of democratically organized and run. Did you know that you have no constitutional right to vote in a presidential election? There's nothing in the Constitution that says that you get to vote, even for the electors. So there's nothing that says that Pennsylvania's electors have to be chosen by the voters of Pennsylvania. Now, this has just evolved over time. You may remember this in the 2000 election, where there was confusion, debate over how Florida's electors were going to be awarded. There was a recount going on. The Secretary of State of Florida, the one in charge of organizing the vote count and all this stuff, who happened to be a Republican, suggested to the Republican-controlled Florida House, hey, why doesn't and legislature, why doesn't the legislature simply award Florida's electors to George W. Bush? It would have been perfectly constitutional. And indeed, in the early days, in the 1790s, most states did choose their electors by vote of the state legislature. But by the 1820s, most states had shifted to the idea that people would get to vote. Now, I don't mean all the people. I don't mean women. I don't mean African Americans. But I do mean nearly all adult white males could vote by the 1920s, which was a big step forward because in the 1790s, even of adult white males, only a minority could vote. So it was a big step toward democracy, and when Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828, he was seen as the first people's president in two senses. One, he was the first really ordinary person to be elected president. And second, he was chosen by the people in a more straightforward way, even as convoluted as it still was, than any president before. And from that moment until this, one of the principal markers of success of a presidential candidate is the common touch. You have to appeal to ordinary Americans. When George Washington was running for president, he didn't run for president, he just stood there for president. People did not expect to be treated as George Washington's equal. They were content, they were willing to look up to George Washington. By the time of Andrew Jackson and ever since, voters expect to be able to look that candidate right in the eye. And in fact, if you want, as a rough and ready approximation, to guess to who's going to win a particular presidential election, it's who do the most voters feel that they'd be most comfortable having a beer with. It has very much less to do with policies. It just has to do with how does that candidate make you feel. And you can see it right there in 1828, and almost immediately, 12 years later, 1840, William Henry Harrison, he was almost sort of a rich guy. He was born on a plantation. He liked fine wine, but he ran for president on a campaign of what was called a log cabin and hard cider. Stories were made up that he had been born in a log cabin. Nowhere near that. And he didn't drink hard cider. He drank imported French wine. But he had to act the part. So, as Sam Goldwyn once said, sincerity, it's the most important thing. And once you can learn to fake it, you've got it made. So,
you've tempted us with your speculations about an upcoming civil war. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, okay. I will. You can say you heard it here first. So actually, I've got a piece that's going to be running in the Washington Post in the next few days that outlines this. And here's how it goes. So with a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, there will be some conservative state, more than one perhaps, that will test Roe v. Wade, the 1973 case that gave rise to the idea of a right to abortion. And whether it happens the first time or the second time or the third time, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the court overturns Roe v. Wade, despite the fact that Brett Kavanaugh has said that he considers that to be settled law. And I draw a historical analogy to the Dred Scott decision of 1857. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820. For 37 years, the principle that Congress can legislate for or against slavery in the federal territories had been settled opinion. All of a sudden, it was unsettled. So, should the Supreme Court overturn Roe v. Wade, the first thing that would happen is that conservative states of the South and parts of the Midwest, would almost certainly pass more restrictive laws against abortion. States on the coast, the Pacific coast and the Northeast, they would probably have or continue to have more liberal laws. But the next step for the strong anti-abortionists would be to try to outlaw abortion nationwide. And in this regard, and I know I make some people uncomfortable when I say this, but I think a good historical analogy for the sort of hardcore anti-abortion groups is the hardcore abolitionists, because this was a moral issue for them, and they were willing to take their moral views and try to impose them on the rest of the country. So, let's say you live in California, and it looks as though Congress is going to outlaw abortion in California. Californians might very well decide, you know what? And here's the key. It wouldn't be just that issue, but it would be a feeling we can't live in a country with people like this who are going to tell us what we can and cannot do, what we have thought for decades we had as our rights. And so there will be, even short of that, there might very well be a kind of sifting out of liberals and conservatives, particularly on this issue. So if you live in Mississippi and you want to get an abortion, you're going to have to go to a more liberal state. And you might decide to stay there. You're more comfortable there. The one thing that until now, even until now, that has kept this abortion issue, which involves people with very deeply morally held positions, and they're essentially uncompromisable because it has to do with how do you define life, how do you define rights. the thing that has kept it from becoming really divisive is the fact that until now, people who are pro-choice and pro-life live scattered all around the country. But in the scenario I've described, they will start to sift out. And anyway, you don't have to have one group that is entirely in control. But should there come a time when Californians begin to think, you know, there's just no future for us in this country. And it could come about by other means. If, for example, just suppose that Donald Trump should be reelected in 2020 again with a minority of the popular vote. This would be, you know, 3 out of the last, 6, where the wrong person, if you take this view, got elected. Something's wrong in the most recent midterm elections. The Democrats got 7% more of the total congressional vote, and their majority in the House and their minority in the Senate doesn't reflect this at all. So when people start to think the system is unfair, California, if it were an independent country, would be the 6th largest economy in the world. California clearly could go its own way. And if California started talking about secession, Oregon and Washington almost certainly would say, yeah, we're with you too. And there might very well be something like a referendum, a secession convention, a movement. And then the question would arise, okay, what would the rest of the country do about it? Would Mississippi and Iowa and Texas fight to keep California in the Union? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that part. But this kind of sifting out that gave rise to the Civil War, it's not impossible. If there is a single lesson to take away from all this, it's HenryClay and Daniel Webster and John Calhoun knew something that we've forgotten. And that is that, yes, democracy requires constant tending. You cannot take it for granted. When HenryClay was born in 1777. The United States was 1 year old. He was 10 when the Constitution was written. And so he knew this thing might work and it might not. And the knowledge that it might not work, that we have to work hard to make it work, kept him at this idea of compromising. We live at a time when we're almost 225 years under our current Constitution. We think it's going to last forever. Well, there's no guarantee that it will. It does require tending. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Delighted to be back.